This is the first trip for President Macron to China since 2019. The last time he met with Xi Jinping was on the sidelines of the G20 in November in Bali, and the meeting there seemed a little bit cold. And look, President Macron has said since he was elected he wanted to go to China once a year to meet the leaders there. But of course, since then, there's been the war in Ukraine and the pandemic. So a very different world now that he's returning to China. China is also quite different, one that is asserting its position in the world. There's more of a power dynamic here that we are seeing. So, of course, Ukraine, again, will be one of the top hot issues that we'll be discussing today, because, of course, this visit to Beijing comes just a couple of weeks after Xi Jinping himself was in Moscow meeting Vladimir Putin. This question of the support that China might bring to Russia is a red line, according to a lot of French officials, there, and providing arms to Russia as well. So in the speech last night, President Macron talked about how he wants to re-engage with China and how China can play a major role in bringing peace to Ukraine. So a difficult balancing act here for President Macron. Of course, again, the war in Ukraine, the cooling off the relation between China and the US, and we've seen that Speaker McCarthy is in Taiwan at the moment. And at the same time, Europe talking about strategic autonomy, potentially decoupling with the supply chain issues, etc., etc. At the same time, they want to benefit from the reopening of the Chinese economy. And when we see about half of the CAC 40 have sent their chairman or their CEO traveling with President Macron right now. So difficult balancing act here for President Macron, who's also traveling with the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. So here a little bit, as you were saying earlier, Jeff, a bit of a good cop, bad cop act potentially, with President Macron hoping to be the good cop. But again, this is all happening, this travel of President Macron, with in the background what's happening domestically, the protest against the pension reform. Today is the 11th day of nationwide strike and protest. Yesterday, the Prime Minister met with the unions the first time since January, and this meeting didn't go well, lasted only 55 minutes. So this issue is not going anywhere. Certainly, President Macron is a leader who needs a win, and he often uses international scene and international travel and his international stature to have these wins, but it's very uncertain whether he will get it through this trip. But interestingly, his surname in Chinese, President Macron, when he translates to Chinese character, translates as the horse that tamed the dragon. Yes. So maybe that's what he hopes to be. He did gift a horse to Xi Jinping in his last visit to China, and that hopefully he hopes to have a positive trip this time around as well.
Yes, and the Chinese love symbolism, of course, and they love to play with words. So no doubt that will be picked up in some quarters. I always wonder. I know President Macron loves a good military parade. He's quite often seen inspecting the troops in Paris. But I often think with these things, you know, you do wonder if he did spot a slightly grubby tunic or a tarnished sword, whether he'd ever stop and say anything. I don't suppose you do that, do you, when you're inspecting somebody else's troops? But he's running down the line here. Just to locate this for you geographically, of course, we're in Tiananmen Square. This is to the west of the square with the Great Hall of the People in the backdrop, those steps that they came down, which is where the National People's Congress is held. So he's doing a full circuit here of the band and the People's Liberation Army troops laid out for inspection, and so far so good. You know, this is the full honor guard, if you like. So Beijing is showing him full accord and respect at this stage ahead of those talks, and knowing how large Tiananmen Square is and the Great Hall of the People is, you know, it's always an awe-inspiring sight. The Chinese always boast how much bigger it is than that small square they have in Moscow, which was why it was built bigger than Red Square in Moscow historically, so that the Chinese could just make a point about bigger is better when it comes to single-party state dictatorships. But very interesting that we still haven't seen Ursula von der Leyen. So she is not being accorded the same status as President Macron, as the leader of a country.
No, so that's the beginning of the bilateral between Macron and Xi Jinping. And then Ursula von der Leyen will have her own bilateral, and then there will be the state dinner later tonight. And there will be another dinner with Xi Jinping actually tomorrow, when President Macron is going to Guangzhou with his meeting Chinese students and investors. And yeah, very interesting dynamic there. And there's a lot of issues. You know, we talk about trade wars and the semiconductors and TikTok and Taiwan. There's just so many difficult and tricky issues to discuss, and at the same time they want to carry on with having some good contracts being signed by French companies, and Airbus is one of those. They say there won't be a mega deal like they've been announced in the last visit. So it's all these things that is recalibrating the relation between China and Europe. And interestingly again, that President Macron is going there representing the French interest, but of course with Ursula von der Leyen also representing the whole of the European bloc. But the European bloc is within itself disagreeing on what they should do with China and what's the line to hold with them. So again, a difficult balancing act. It's all been nice at the moment. As you were saying, the Chinese media are not talking about the domestic issues that President Macron is dealing with, even though it's something they could use to kind of impact his status and the impact of this visit. And at the moment, they've been playing nice, and the visit is starting well, but the bilateral is just about to start. So we'll see, as you said, get hints from the body language and some of the statement that they're doing later today as well, to have a hint on whether there is a reboot of the relationship, or whether after that visit to Moscow last week, things are getting more and more difficult with China.
One of the things that's interesting about this visit, clearly Macron wants to continue with this push to be seen as an international peacekeeper, even though some of his efforts have been in vain. We all remember the trip to visit President Putin with that long table, and obviously we all know what happened in the aftermath of that visit. The Russian war in Ukraine busted out in full force. But one thing that's interesting here is that Olaf Scholz is nowhere near what's happening in Beijing. He made a one-day visit to China last year, in contrast to this big parade and this big deal that Macron is making of this trip. I wonder to what extent the other European nations, how they feel about Macron taking on this leadership role in the absence of Olaf Scholz on the world stage.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because that Olaf Scholz trip was actually controversial in France, because previously Angela Merkel and Macron had coordinated travels, had traveled together to China, and this time Olaf Scholz went without warning France. Not that they had to warn, but without coordinating. And so that was a bit controversial, since that they were doing a go-alone. And well, this time Macron is going with Ursula von der Leyen. But from a Macron point of view, he's always used the international scene, and that's the prerogative of the president, to do foreign trips, to make his profile bigger on the domestically as well, but use international scene to big up his profile internally. But the problem is that since the war in Ukraine, that hasn't worked. As you were saying, that trip to Moscow hasn't worked out. Even though he's gone to Kyiv, it looked like the UK and Boris Johnson at the time had been taking a higher profile on that front. So he's trying as well to reboot, while domestically he's having these issues, reboot as well his profile on the international scene, and probably a worry that what's happening in France and the pictures we saw last week of fire in the streets of Paris is damaging that thing. So this is also for him what's at stake, is a certain reboot of his own profile from an international point of view, because he hadn't had a win on that front for a long time, and from a domestic point of view as well.
No, just on the PLA soldiers. I mean, historically, the uniforms would have been different colours to denote the different services, with the white of the Navy, the dark green of the Army, and then the blue of the Air Force here. So as you would have seen that parade marching by, all services represented, and just perhaps I think at these events always a little bit of an opportunity for the hosting state just to project a little bit of power and pomp and circumstance here. So no doubt buried in there, deep in the subconscious of the Chinese organisers, will have been the desire here to promote and present the best of the Chinese military, as a reminder to those watchers of the other geopolitical stories that we're very much involved with.
I think another notable thing about this scene is the number of masks. I mean, it's not long ago that China abandoned its zero COVID policy, but clearly it is still playing a role. A number of those standing by are wearing them.
And yet they were still shaking hands, so it's quite interesting. But they said that the number of journalists traveling with the president has been smaller than usual because of COVID. Everybody's been tested, etc., etc. But they have been shaking shaking hands. So, but interesting you're saying rolling the red carpet quite literally for President Macron. And what we're saying about his international travel, he had a huge state visit in the US as well with Biden. There was also hugely high profile, those dinners, the wives, Brigitte Macron and Mrs. Biden meeting as well. So that's, he is doing a lot of these international travel again and be having the red carpet rolled out. But the question is anything coming out of this? And, the relationship with the US, the question of the IRA, AUKUS, et cetera, that's still on the table. Here with China, where we'll see shortly whether we get anything out of this visit. So these trips are happening. The red carpet is being rolled out. How much is coming out of those? It's quite limited.
Well, at least